So we're going to talk about data, and then I'll have a piece that I just want to say about measurement of overall, how to quantify systems. So this is Lord Kelvin, may have said these things, right? I mean, I guess so. To measure is to know, and if you can't measure, you can't improve it, right? So this is these are good things, and we can forget this a little bit depending on the field you're in. You can get a little too excited about theory or whatever it is, and forget the big picture. But I've come to appreciate in some of the work we've done, and many other people have done, that we're building, instruments like you might build microscopes, right? And I'll have some more about that. But we're building the instruments you need in this big data world to kind of measure things. He also said some other things. So X-rays will prove to be a hoax. So we always cherry pick these things. There's nothing new to be discovered in physics. All that remains is more and more precise measurement. So quantum would have been a bit of a shock there. And then chaos theory, just a total disaster. Anyway, usually when people say these sorts of things, they're like very important people say these kinds of things, like we'll never get da-da-da. There, it's not right. Okay, so, and this is like a measurement instrument piece here. So just looking back over time, how we've measured time. So early on, we kind of got hold of the whole season thing, right? And started to realize that that it was pretty stable, and so we were able to put up some big rocks and time things and count things and so on, and things like Stonehenge and so on. So that was possible. Sundials are old, not super old in a way, but they seem to be maybe back here, 1500. But we didn't have anything much better than sundials for a long time, right? And now it's sort of insane where we are now. But these sorts of objects that we were able to, so hourglasses are, you've actually got to make something pretty well, I suppose, for that to work, but that took a long time to get to. Pendulum clocks of the 1500s. And then we get to this point, this is a very important point in history for measurement of time, was actually comes out of measuring longitude. Yeah, so some of you may know about this. So longitude was the very difficult piece to measure. If you're sailing around the water, being English and ridiculous, and doing bad things to the world, but and then crashing in. But occasionally you get destroyed, right? And that was a expensive bad thing to happen. And it was largely because they didn't know where they were in this direction, right? So their X bit was off. Latitude you could do with stars, right? That was good. They had the Polaris business. Not so good on the southern hemisphere, but it was workable. There was a couple of threads of how to do this, and a lot of money was offered at the time. It was, I think, really a large sum to solve this problem, right? So how are we going to measure longitude? And various directions we're going off with stars, right? We're going to have these elaborate maps and astrolabes, and we're going to do it. But you need to have all sorts of detailed records, these books to look up. But there was Harrison and then his son were these sort of further. They weren't really in the sort of inner sanctum of all of this. They were bent on building really good clocks that would they weren't pendulum clocks. They were these mechanical things that would just tick. Yeah, and you could wind them up and they would work for months and months. Potentially because you need them to work for a year. You've been off wandering around in the water and you're not sure where you are anymore. So. And then you could know what time it was back in Greenwich, and be able to figure things out from the day, from sunrise and so on. So this was a tremendous transition, but this is the 1700s, right? So now we can measure time well, and that begins to fit in with everything else we're doing with mechanical stuff, right? This is around the time where we begin to think maybe the world or the universe runs like this, and then someone says, well, what about God? And so that was a little bit terrifying for a few people. Galileo had sort of had his run in as well, but still it turns. I guess it's a little. I mean, he totally squibbed on it, right? He said, you guys are right. Anyway, so okay, so that's a big change. And then actually, Lord Kelvin, when you had this idea of atoms, I guess he said, we'll get to billionths of a second. So that was well done by him. This you don't have to read this, but this is, and I don't know if this is holding up super well, but it's true, at least in general, right? So the thermometers took us a long time to get to. It's temperature, right? So we're very used to temperature. We have our own feeling for it, but The idea that you could measure it and that it would be something that you could make this instrument, someone else, you could give them instructions, they'd make an instrument, you know, and do this in this nice scientific way was not really clear, right? So this, I guess there's some argument now about how much of this is really holding up. But you know, the idea that people, of course, would have their own versions of temperature. It's not just, this is obviously some of this about humidity and so on. Yes, we could agree it's warmer today than it was yesterday, you know, like it's a big change, but like how you feel, like there was a sort of a human element to it that might render it sort of impossible to be on a scale, right? Not like, you know, measuring distance. You know, I'm going to make a stick, you can make another stick, and we'll mark it and so on, and we both have the same measuring sticks. Or, and as it was for kilograms, or for weight, and only recently this has changed, right? The kilogram for all of humanity was just this block of metal in Paris. That's the reference kilogram. Really just a dangerous kind of way to run science. And you know, other things like seconds and so on, it's just a specification. So you have to go and find the, I can't remember the details, cesium atoms, I think it is, right? And the decay and so on, and measure it from that. And that's a reliable thing that we have nothing to do with, right? We didn't make some object from which you have to all, you know, make a reference. Nature did it. So this was something that took a couple of hundred years from there to build one. And again, I hope this sort of holds up. But there is this very interesting book, Inventing Temperature, that I have actually, just on the history of getting to making thermometers. And then you get into the 1700s, 1800s. Eventually, we have these really good ones. And then thermodynamics takes off, right? So all of this is to say you have to measure things well. And you know, again, this may not seem surprising, but it's as we sort of move off into these sort of weirder realms, especially sort of social phenomena and human phenomena, like how do you measure them well? How do you actually come up with instruments that are reliable? More things about data. So this is sort of the summary of thinking, I suppose. So this is the pure math world, right? It's just you oscillate between these two states, and but this is unfortunately what happens, right? So and we were up until the 90s in a lot of areas. You were just like happily living up here, making up stuff, and then this happened. So, but it happened for physics, right? It happened for biology, right? Now there's DNA, and you can't make up things about humors or something or whatever. You know, we observed enough rotations of planets and so on to figure out the ellipse thing and not get killed by religious people. And then you're back to sad. But anyway, you can choose your own path, right? But you can live here. That's okay. String theory people live here. Yeah. Mostly. Anyway, that's a very enjoyable feature of what's happened.